History reveres Abraham Lincoln as a savior, but it often forgets that his successor was a catastrophe. This is the story of Andrew Johnson, the accidental president who stumbled into history blind drunk at his own inauguration, rambling so incoherently that Lincoln hid his face in shame. He was the first American president to be impeached, escaping political execution by a single, terrifying vote. But his legacy is darker than mere incompetence. Johnson was a stubborn force of nature who waged a personal war to dismantle Lincoln's emancipation legacy, plunging a healing nation back into chaos. The Civil War ended at Appomattox, but the tragedy of the peace began with him. Raleigh, North Carolina, in the winter of 1808, was not a place of opportunity. It was a rigid caste system carved into the landscape. At the very top sat the planter aristocracy, the men who owned the land, the slaves, and the government. Below them were the yeoman farmers scratching out a living. And at the very bottom, submerged in a desperate struggle for survival, were the landless, poor whites. This was the world Andrew Johnson was born into, a world where he was effectively invisible. His father, Jacob Johnson, was a man of no property but immense physical courage, holding the lowly position of a bank porter. In a cruel twist of fate that would foreshadow the son's life, Jacob died a hero's death, saving two wealthy socialites from drowning in an icy creek, only to leave his own family in absolute destitution. Andrew was 3 years old. The town of Raleigh erected no monument to Jacob. They simply let his widow wash their clothes and his son starve. This early trauma planted a seed in the boy's chest that would never stop growing, a burning, venomous resentment of the rich. To the young Andrew Johnson, the Southern aristocracy wasn't a romantic ideal of cavaliers and moonlight. It was a boot on his neck. He grew up hearing the whispers, the slurs thrown at families like his, mudsills, trash, the disposable byproducts of a slave economy. His mother, unable to feed him, was forced to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At the age of 10, she legally bound him as an indentured servant to a local tailor. The psychological weight of this was crushing. In a society defined by the stark line between freedom and slavery, 10-year-old Andrew Johnson was sold into bondage. He wasn't a slave, he was white, but he wasn't free. For years, he sat cross-legged on a hard wooden bench, stitching breeches for the very men who looked through him as if he were glass. The needle pricked his fingers, the dust filled his lungs. He was illiterate, unwashed, and seething, while the sons of the planters were learning Latin and Greek, preparing to rule the country. Andrew Johnson was learning the texture of wool and the bitter taste of envy. He watched them through the shop window, the carriages, the fine clothes, the easy laughter of men born to power. He didn't just want to be them, he wanted to destroy them. This creates the first half of Andrew Johnson's fatal flaw, his hamartia. He developed a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. He convinced himself that he was the champion of the common man, the plebeian fighting the patrician. But this populism was defensive, born of shame. He wasn't fighting for equality, he was fighting for vengeance against the class that had humiliated his father. In 1824, the pressure became too much. In a moment of reckless desperation, the teenage Johnson ran away. He broke his indenture contract, effectively making himself a fugitive. His master put a bounty on his head, $10 for the return of the runaway tailor. The irony was stark. The future president of the United States had his face plastered on wanted posters, hunted like a criminal for the crime of wanting to own his own labor. He fled over the Smoky Mountains, crossing the rugged spine of the Appalachians to disappear into the frontier town of Greenville, Tennessee. Greenville was rougher, wilder, and more fluid than Raleigh. It was hill country, where the plantation economy was weaker, and a man could reinvent himself. Here, the fugitive tailor set up his own shop, and here he met the person who would save him from himself. Eliza McCardle was a miracle in Andrew Johnson's life. She was the daughter of a shoemaker, possessing a quiet grace and, critically, an education. When they married in 1827, Johnson was 18, barely able to spell his own name. It is one of the most intimate and revealing scenes of his life. Picture the candle burning low in the small tailor shop, the day's work done. The door is locked against the world. Inside, the rough, angry young man sits hunched over a book, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Eliza gently guides his finger across the page. She taught him to write. She taught him arithmetic. She read to him while he sewed, histories, speeches, the Constitution. Eliza was the silent architect of his intellect. She took his raw, incoherent rage and sharpened it into a weapon. Without her, Andrew Johnson remains an illiterate tailor cursing the dark. With her, he found his voice. But even Eliza couldn't scrub the hate out of his soul. As Johnson's world expanded, the second, darker half of his political DNA solidified. If he hated the rich white man above him, he held an even deeper, more primal contempt for the black man below him. This is the crucial key to unlocking the disaster of his presidency. Johnson was a white supremacist in the most literal sense. In the precarious hierarchy of the South, the only thing that separated a poor white from total social oblivion was the existence of a caste even lower than himself. He needed slavery. He needed the black man to be in chains so that he, the tailor, could feel like a king. His hatred of the aristocracy was class warfare. His hatred of the slave was psychological survival. Armed with this dual hatred, anti-aristocrat and anti-black, Johnson stormed into Tennessee politics. He didn't run for office, he brawled for it. He was a magnificent stump speaker, possessed of a terrifying feral energy. He didn't use flowery language. He went for the jugular. He mocked his opponents' clothes, their accents, their wealth. He rallied the mountain men and the mechanics, telling them that he was their shield against the stuck-up elites. He rose with meteoric speed, mayor, congressman, governor, senator. By the 1850s, Andrew Johnson was a force of nature in Washington, but he was a loner. He had no real friends, only temporary allies. He trusted no one. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He viewed the growing abolitionist movement in the North not as a moral crusade, but as a hypocritical plot by Northern industrialists to destroy the white working man of the South. Yet, oddly enough, he also despised the Southern secessionists. He viewed the fire eaters of South Carolina, men like Jefferson Davis, as arrogant fools who were going to destroy the Union just to protect their own wealth. Johnson loved the Union. He worshiped the Constitution with a religious fervor, mostly because he saw it as the ultimate contract. And as a tailor, he respected a contract. You didn't break the bond. Then came the fire, 1860. Abraham Lincoln is elected. The South goes mad. State after state passes ordinances of secession. The Senate chamber in Washington becomes a theater of treason. One by one, Southern senators stand up, deliver weeping speeches about Southern honor, and walk out. It was a mass exodus of the elite. But on December 18, 1860, Andrew Johnson stood up in the Senate. The galleries were packed. Everyone expected the senator from Tennessee to follow his brothers out the door. Instead, Johnson unleashed a thunderbolt. He looked his Southern colleagues in the eye and declared that secession was treason. He roared, "I am for the Union, the whole Union, and nothing but the Union." It was a shockwave, a Southern Democrat, a slave owner himself, denouncing the Confederacy before the war had even begun. Overnight, he became the most hated man in the South and the most unlikely hero in the North. In Tennessee, they burned him in effigy. Crowds gathered at train stations to lynch him. He had to travel with a loaded revolver on his lap, staring down mobs who called him a traitor to his people. But this only fueled him. Johnson loved the fight. He loved the martyrdom. He stayed in his seat, the solitary figure from a Confederate state refusing to abandon the flag. This specific moment of physical and political courage seduced the North. It seduced Abraham Lincoln. They looked at Johnson and saw a symbol of loyalty, a man who put country over section. They didn't look close enough to see why he was loyal. They didn't see that he wasn't fighting for the same Union they were. Lincoln was fighting for a new birth of freedom. Johnson was fighting to preserve the old Union of 1850, a Union where the Constitution was supreme and the black man was subservient. He was fighting the Confederates not because they held slaves, but because they had broken the law. The war came and went, a meat grinder that chewed up a generation. Lincoln, navigating the labyrinth of the conflict, needed a masterstroke for the election of 1864. The war was dragging on. The casualty lists from the Wilderness and Cold Harbor were horrific. Northern morale was cracking. Lincoln feared he would lose the election to the Democrats, who would sue for peace and recognize the Confederacy. He needed to broaden his coalition. He needed to show that this wasn't just a Republican war, but a national war. He needed a war Democrat. He needed a Southerner who had bled for the Union. He needed Andrew Johnson. The decision to drop Vice President Hannibal Hamlin and replace him with Johnson on the National Union ticket was a cold, calculated political maneuver. It was optics over substance. Lincoln assumed that the vice presidency was a harmless office, a ceremonial garage for a useful political symbol. He could never imagine that the assassin's bullet was already being cast in lead. So, in the summer of 1864, the die was cast. The rail splitter from Illinois and the tailor from Tennessee joined forces. It seemed like a poetic union. Two self-made men, two children of poverty who had risen to the highest heights. But beneath the surface, there was a fatal disconnect. Lincoln had grown during the war. His soul had expanded to embrace the moral necessity of emancipation. Johnson had not grown. He had merely hardened. He was still the angry boy from Raleigh fighting a class war in his head, blind to the racial revolution happening around him. As the election approached, Johnson was sent to Tennessee to serve as military governor. He ruled with an iron fist, seizing the property of the rich rebels he hated, relishing the power. He famously told a group of freed slaves, "I will be your Moses." It was a great line, a theatrical promise of deliverance. But Andrew Johnson had no intention of leading anyone to the promised land. He was merely enjoying the applause. The stage was set. The tragedy was scripted. The National Union ticket won a crushing victory. The Civil War was nearing its bloody end. And Andrew Johnson, a man consumed by resentments, armed with a rigid literalist mind and blinded by white supremacy, packed his bags for Washington. He was coming to take his place as the second highest official in the land. He believed he had earned it. He believed he was the savior of the Constitution. He had no idea that he was walking into a trap of his own making and that his very nature was about to collide with the greatest crisis in American history. The tailor was about to try to mend a torn nation, but he only knew how to use a needle, not how to heal the flesh. If history were a novel, critics would call the events of March 4th, 1865, too heavy-handed. They would say the foreshadowing was too obvious, the symbolism too crude. But history is not a novel. It is a chaotic, tumbling series of accidents. And on this particular rainy Saturday in Washington, D.C., the American Republic was about to witness an accident that would serve as a grim prophecy for the years to come. Washington in the spring of 1865 was less a city and more a festering wound beginning to scab over. After 4 years of civil war, the capital was a slurry of mud, manure, and exhaustion. The unpaved streets were churned into a brown paste by the wheels of artillery caissons and the boots of returning soldiers. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, coal smoke, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of the Potomac marshes. Yet beneath the grime, there was a frantic, electric hope. The Confederacy was collapsing. General Lee was cornered. The end was visible. It was Inauguration Day. Abraham Lincoln was to be sworn in for his second term, the hard-won reward for holding the Union together through its darkest night. But the eyes of the political class were not just on Lincoln. They were curiously fixed on his new partner, the man from Tennessee, Andrew Johnson. Johnson had arrived in Washington a few days earlier, and he was not well. He was recovering from a severe bout of typhoid fever, a disease that had left him gaunt, shaky, and physically depleted. The bulldog of the Senate was reduced to a trembling invalid. On the morning of the inauguration, Johnson was at the Capitol feeling the room spinning. He complained of a deep, hollow weakness in his chest. He turned to the outgoing Vice President, Hannibal Hamlin, and asked for a stimulant, something to steel his nerves before he had to face the packed Senate chamber. Hamlin, likely thinking nothing of it, produced a bottle of whiskey. Johnson poured a tumbler, then another, and then a third. It was a catastrophic medical error. On an empty stomach, ravaged by fever and dehydration, the alcohol didn't just steady him, it hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The man who was about to take the second highest office in the land was, to put it bluntly, blind drunk. The scene inside the Senate chamber was already stifling. It was packed to the rafters with the elite of the American government, Supreme Court justices in their black robes, foreign ambassadors dripping in gold braid and medals, senators, generals, and cabinet members. The air was hot, humid, and airless. When the doors opened and Andrew Johnson was escorted to the podium to take his oath, the first thing people noticed was the flush. His face was a glowing, violent red. His eyes were glassy, struggling to focus on the sea of faces before him. He began to speak. It was supposed to be a short, dignified formality. Instead, it became a national nightmare. Johnson didn't deliver a speech. He launched into a rambling, incoherent harangue. The alcohol had stripped away his filter, and what poured out was the raw, unfiltered insecurity of the tailor from Raleigh. He forgot where he was. He forgot the dignity of the office. He reverted to the stump speaker in the Tennessee mountains, screaming at the hecklers. "I am a plebeian," he shouted, his words slurring, his hand chopping the air aggressively. "I glory in it. I am one of the people." The chamber went deathly silent. Men exchanged horrified glances. But Johnson was just getting started. He turned his gaze upon the front row, where the Supreme Court justices sat, and the foreign diplomats were arranged like peacocks. He pointed a shaking finger directly at them. He lectured the ambassadors on their aristocratic pretensions, telling them that in America the people were the true sovereigns and that their titles meant nothing to him. He was picking a fight with the entire diplomatic corps of the world. Then he turned to the cabinet members. He began to call them out by name, demanding they recognize his humble origins. "Mr. Seward," he bellowed at the Secretary of State, "I tell you, you are a plebeian. And you, Mr. Stanton—" He paused. He swayed. His mind went blank. He had forgotten the name of the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. He leaned over to a clerk, whispering loudly, "What is the name of the Secretary of the Navy?" It was a spectacle of excruciating humiliation. Behind him, Abraham Lincoln sat frozen. The president's head was bowed, his long, sorrowful face buried in his hands, seemingly trying to make himself disappear. He did not look angry. He looked pained. He looked like a father watching a son destroy himself in public. A reporter in the gallery noted that Lincoln's face wore an expression of unutterable sorrow. Finally, after 20 agonizing minutes, the clerk of the Senate managed to guide Johnson through the oath of office. Johnson kissed the Bible with a sloppy, theatrical fervor, shouting, "I kiss this book in the face of my nation of the United States." As the ceremony moved outside to the east portico for Lincoln's address, the whispers were already flying. "The man is a drunkard," one senator hissed. "A disgrace." "Is he mad?" Lincoln, with his characteristic magnanimity, tried to perform damage control immediately. Later that afternoon, when his aides expressed their horror, Lincoln waved them off gently. "I have known Andy Johnson for many years," he said. "He made a bad slip the other day, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard." It was an act of profound grace. Lincoln was trying to protect his partner, trying to preserve the unity of the ticket. But in hindsight, it is a statement dripping with tragic irony. Lincoln was right. Johnson wasn't an alcoholic in the clinical sense, but he was wrong about the danger. The slip wasn't just about whiskey. It was a revelation of character. The alcohol hadn't changed Johnson. It had revealed him. It showed a man consumed by class envy, a man who, when the pressure was on, retreated into himself and lashed out at the world. It showed a man who had no sense of occasion, no diplomatic tact, and no ability to read the room. For the next 6 weeks, Johnson became a ghost. Ashamed and sick, he retreated to the Kirkwood House Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. He avoided the White House. He avoided the Senate. He was the embarrassing uncle the administration was trying to hide in the attic. And while Johnson nursed his hangover and his pride, the war ended. April 9th, 1865. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The news hit Washington like a thunderclap of joy. The city exploded. Cannons fired salutes until the windows rattled. Strangers embraced in the streets. The long nightmare was over. The Union was whole. The slaves were free. On April 14th, Good Friday, the mood in the Capitol was delirious. It was a day of sunshine and lilacs. The very air tasted like victory. That evening, President Lincoln decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater, a light British comedy called Our American Cousin. He wanted to laugh. He deserved to laugh. Andrew Johnson was alone in his room at the Kirkwood House. He had planned a quiet evening. He had no idea that just a few blocks away, in a tawdry boarding house, a group of desperate men were finalizing a plot that would drag him out of the shadows and thrust him into the blinding light of history. John Wilkes Booth did not just plan to kill Lincoln. The conspiracy was a decapitation strike. The plan was to kill the president, the Secretary of State William Seward, and the Vice President Andrew Johnson. By killing the top 3 men in the line of succession, Booth hoped to throw the federal government into chaos, perhaps giving the Confederacy a chance to rise from the ashes. The man assigned to kill Andrew Johnson was named George Atzerodt. Atzerodt was a carriage painter, a smuggler, and a man of weak will. He was not a killer. As the sun set on April 14th, Atzerodt checked into the Kirkwood House, the very same hotel where Johnson was staying. He had a knife and a revolver in his pocket. He knew Johnson's room number. The plan was simple: knock on the door, and when the vice president answered, shoot him in the chest. But fate, which had been so cruel to Johnson in his youth, now intervened with a bizarre stroke of luck. George Atzerodt lost his nerve. While Lincoln was sitting in the presidential box at Ford's Theater And while Lewis Powell was savagely stabbing Secretary Seward in his bed across town, George Atzerodt was sitting in the hotel bar downstairs from Andrew Johnson's room. He ordered a drink, then another. He looked at the clock. He looked at the stairs leading up to Johnson's room. He couldn't do it. The enormity of the act crushed him. Instead of climbing the stairs to change history, Atzerodt walked out of the hotel, mounted his horse, and rode away into the night, disappearing into the fog of history until his capture. Andrew Johnson went to bed that night, unaware that death had been sitting one floor below him, drinking whiskey. He was woken abruptly a few hours later, pounding on the door. It was a friend, breathless, face pale as ash. "Mr. Vice President," the voice trembled, "President Lincoln has been shot." Johnson dressed in the dark. The chaos of the night was overwhelming. Rumors were flying. Seward was dead. Grant was dead. The rebels were marching on the city. Johnson rushed to the Peterson House, the cramped boarding house across the street from the theater where the dying president had been taken. He entered the small back bedroom. The sight was gruesome. Lincoln lay diagonally across a bed that was too small for him, his breathing a wet, terrible rasp. The room was packed with weeping men. Johnson stood by the bedside for a moment, looking down at the man who had plucked him from obscurity, the man whose legacy he was about to inherit. He saw the life ebbing out of the last force that could have guided the nation through the peace. Mrs. Lincoln, hysterical with grief in the front parlor, despised Johnson. When she heard he had arrived, she screamed that she did not want to see that man. Johnson, perhaps sensing that his presence was a burden, or perhaps terrified by the reality crashing down on him, left after a short time. He walked back out into the rainy, terror-filled night. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died. The church bells of the city began to toll, a slow, mournful sound that rolled over the mud and the monuments. 3 hours later, in the parlor of the Kirkwood House, a small group gathered. Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase arrived, carrying a Bible. Andrew Johnson stood in the center of the room. He looked grim. The redness was gone from his face, replaced by a stony gray pallor. He was sober now. The terrifying clarity of the situation had sobered him completely. He placed his hand on the Bible. His voice did not shake this time. He repeated the oath. "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States." In that moment, the National Union died. The coalition of forgiveness and firmness that Lincoln had built died with him. The power of the presidency, the immense dictatorial powers of a wartime executive, was transferred from a man of infinite empathy to a man of infinite grievance. As Johnson lowered his hand, those in the room felt a profound unease. They were looking at a stranger, a man who, just 6 weeks ago, had humiliated the nation, a man who had been a poor white tailor, a slave owner, a Democrat, a Unionist, a pariah. The Civil War was over. But the war for the soul of America was just beginning, and the general leading the Union forces had just been replaced by a man who, deep in his heart, still sympathized with the enemy. The spring of 1865 melted into a suffocating, humid summer, and with the heat came a silence that was more dangerous than the roar of cannons. In Washington, the Grand Review of the Armies took place in May, a 2-day parade of Union might where 150,000 hardened veterans marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. It was a river of blue wool and glittering bayonets, a final thunderous statement that the North had conquered. But as the last regiment marched past the reviewing stand and the soldiers boarded trains to go home, a vacuum opened up in the Capitol. Congress was not in session. Due to the leisurely political calendar of the 19th century, the legislative branch had adjourned in March and was not scheduled to reconvene until December. This left a gap of 8 months, a lifetime in politics. For 8 fateful months, there was no check on executive power. There was only Andrew Johnson. He sat alone in the White House, the sole architect of the peace. The future of 4 million freed slaves in 11 defeated states rested entirely in the hands of the man who, just weeks earlier, had been stumbling drunk on the Senate dais. At first, the radical Republicans, the fierce moral absolutists of the party who believed in racial equality and harsh justice for the South, were optimistic. They looked at Johnson and saw a kindred spirit. Hadn't he spent the war screaming, "Treason must be made odious"? Hadn't he promised to hang the rebel leaders? Senator Ben Wade, a radical firebrand, famously told the new president, "Johnson, we have faith in you. By the gods, there will be no trouble now in running the government." They made a fatal miscalculation. They confused Johnson's class hatred for moral conviction. They thought Johnson hated the Confederacy because it was evil. In reality, he only hated it because it was rich. Once the plantation owners were defeated, broken, and humiliated, Johnson's anger toward them evaporated, replaced by a deep ancestral need to be accepted by them. And his hatred for the black man, which had been overshadowed by the war, now surged to the forefront. On May 29, 1865, Johnson unveiled his plan. It was called the Amnesty Proclamation, but it should have been called the Surrender of the Victory. Johnson offered a blanket pardon to nearly all Confederates. All they had to do was take a simple oath of allegiance to the Union. No trials, no prison time, no confiscation of land, just a promise to be good. With a stroke of a pen, the men who had killed 360,000 Union soldiers were restored to full citizenship, their property rights returned. But there was a twist, a specific peculiar clause that reveals the twisted psychology of Andrew Johnson. He created a list of 14 exceptions to this general pardon. Most were standard, high-ranking Confederate officers, governors, judges. But the 13th exception was personal. Johnson excluded anyone who owned taxable property worth more than $20,000. In 1865, $20,000 was a fortune. This clause was a laser-guided weapon aimed directly at the Southern aristocracy, the very people who had looked down on the tailor from Raleigh. If these wealthy planters wanted a pardon, the proclamation stated they could not take the oath locally. They had to apply directly to the President of the United States. They had to come to Washington. They had to ask him personally. This was Johnson's hamartia in action. He didn't want to destroy the aristocracy. He wanted to be the master of it. He wanted to see the proud men of the South, the men who had once set dogs on runaways like him, standing hat in hand in his waiting room. And they came, by the thousands. Throughout the summer of 1865, the White House became a theater of groveling. The anterooms were choked with the smell of stale tobacco and nervous sweat as former Confederate generals and plantation lords waited for hours to see the president. When they were finally admitted, they bowed. They flattered him. They called him Your Excellency. They appealed to his vanity, telling him that only he, a true Southerner, understood them. They played him like a fiddle. Johnson was intoxicated by it. The sheer ego stroke of having the Southern elite begging for his mercy was more addictive to him than the whiskey he had sworn off. He began signing pardons by the hundreds, then the thousands. He issued pardons until his hand cramped. By the end of 1865, he had pardoned nearly the entire Confederate leadership class. He gave them back their land. He gave them back their political rights. and in exchange he asked for nothing but their flattery. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Down in the South, the message was received loud and clear. The North has given up. The tailor is on our side. The white South, which had been terrified and submissive in April, was defiant and arrogant by August. Since Johnson allowed the old white electorate to vote while denying the vote to black men, the Southern states held elections that were a farce of democracy. They simply voted the Confederacy back into power. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, a man who had spent the war in a prison cell, was elected to the U.S. Senate from Georgia. 4 Confederate generals, 5 Confederate colonels, and 6 Confederate cabinet members were elected to the U.S. Congress. It was a breathtaking act of defiance. They were sending the leadership of the rebellion straight back to Washington to help run the country they had just tried to destroy. But the political resurrection of the rebels was only half the tragedy. The other half was playing out in the cotton fields and the dusty roads of the Deep South. With Johnson's tacit approval, the newly restored Southern legislatures moved to solve their labor problem. The 13th Amendment had legally ended slavery, but it had not defined freedom. Johnson believed that freedom merely meant the right not to be bought and sold. It did not mean the right to vote, to testify in court, to own land, or to have civil rights. So, the South invented a new kind of slavery. They called them the Black Codes. These were laws written with the specific intent of forcing black people back onto the plantations. The details are chilling. In Mississippi, it became a crime for a black man to be unemployed. Every black citizen had to produce a labor contract with a white employer by January of each year. If you didn't have a contract, you were arrested for vagrancy. The punishment for vagrancy was a fine. Since the newly freed slaves had no money, the sheriff would auction off their labor to a white man who would pay the fine. The prisoner would then work for that white man for free until the debt was paid. It was slavery in everything but name. Other codes were equally draconian. Black people were forbidden from owning firearms. They were forbidden from hunting or fishing. They were forbidden from owning land outside of towns. In some towns, they were forbidden from walking on the sidewalks. Violence exploded. Emboldened by Johnson's leniency, white paramilitary groups began to terrorize the countryside. In Memphis and New Orleans, police forces, composed largely of Confederate veterans, led massacres against black communities. Schools were burned, women were raped, men were lynched for the crime of wearing a Union uniform. And what did Andrew Johnson do? He did worse than nothing. He suppressed the reports. Carl Schurz, a Union general and astute observer, traveled through the South that summer and wrote a harrowing report detailing the violence and the unrepentant nature of the rebels. He described a South that had not accepted defeat, but was merely waiting for the chance to reassert control. He placed the report on Johnson's desk. Johnson ignored it. He actually tried to bury it. He preferred the reports of his own hand-picked observers, who told him what he wanted to hear, that the South was peaceful, loyal, and that the only problem was the lazy black people refusing to work. Johnson's racism was not a passive prejudice. It was an active governing philosophy. In a letter to the governor of Mississippi, he wrote, "White men alone must manage the South." He viewed the Freedmen's Bureau, the agency Lincoln had created to feed and clothe the refugees of war, as a corrupt institution that coddled black people. He began to strip it of its power, ordering the return of confiscated lands to the pardoned planters, forcing thousands of freed families off the small plots of land they had been farming. It was a betrayal of biblical proportions. The freed slaves who had looked to the Moses from Tennessee for protection found themselves delivered back to Pharaoh. As the leaves began to turn in the autumn of 1865, the mood in the North shifted from confusion to cold fury. The returning soldiers, who had seen their friends die to save the Union, looked south and saw the very men they had defeated retaking power. They read the newspapers about the Black Codes and realized that the victory was evaporating. In Washington, the radical Republicans were gathering. Thaddeus Stevens, the old commoner, sat in his house in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, his clubfoot propped up, his face a mask of grim determination. Charles Sumner, the scholar-senator from Massachusetts, paced his library, reading the reports of the atrocities. They realized they had been duped. The man in the White House was not a savior. He was a saboteur. December 1865 arrived. The 39th Congress convened. The clerk of the House, a loyal radical named Edward McPherson, began the roll call. The Southern representatives, the Confederate generals and colonels, were waiting in the hall, smug and ready to take their seats, armed with their pardons from Andrew Johnson. McPherson reached the names of the Southern states, Tennessee, Virginia, Alabama. He paused. The chamber held its breath. Then McPherson skipped them. He simply didn't call their names. Chaos erupted on the floor. The Southerners shouted, waving their credentials. "We have been elected. The president has pardoned us." McPherson looked down at them, his face stone cold. "The clerk cannot read the names of members from states that are in rebellion." It was the first shot of the new war. Congress had slammed the door in the face of Johnson's reconstructed South. They refused to seat the rebels. The honeymoon was over. The partnership was dead. Andrew Johnson sat in the White House, listening to the reports of the uproar in the Capitol. His face flushed red, the old anger rising in his gullet. He did not see this as a constitutional crisis. He saw it as a personal insult. The radicals were challenging his authority. They were challenging him. He turned to his aides and muttered a promise of war. He would not compromise. He would not back down. He would use the only weapon the Constitution gave him to destroy their plans. He would veto them into oblivion. The stage was set for a collision that had never happened before in American history, a fight to the death between the president and the Congress, and the prize was the soul of the nation. The year 1866 opened not with the promise of Reconstruction, but with the grim rumble of a new civil war. This conflict, however, would not be fought with bayonets in the Shenandoah Valley, but with parchment and parliamentary procedure in the swampy heat of Washington, D.C. The combatants were clearly drawn. On one side, the radical Republicans in Congress, men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, who believed the victory of 1865 required a fundamental restructuring of American society. On the other side stood Andrew Johnson, the accidental president, a man who believed the war was over, the Union was restored, and everyone should simply go back to 1860, minus the chains, but keeping the shackles. To wage the coming war, Andrew Johnson reached for a weapon that had lain mostly dormant in the American presidency, the veto. Before Johnson, presidents used the veto power with extreme caution. It was a nuclear option, reserved almost exclusively for legislation that the president believed violated the Constitution. It was not a tool for policy disagreements. But Johnson, feeling isolated and besieged, turned the veto into a bludgeon. He didn't just reject bills, he declared war on the legislative branch itself. The first skirmish occurred in February 1866. Congress, horrified by the reports of starvation and abuse coming from the South, passed a bill to extend the life and powers of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau was the only thing standing between the former slaves and total destitution. It provided food, built schools, and adjudicated labor disputes. It was the humanitarian arm of the Union victory. Johnson vetoed it. His message was a shock to the system. He argued that the Constitution did not allow the federal government to support indigent persons, and essentially claimed that helping freed slaves would make them lazy. The white race, he implied, had never received such help. It was a callous, legalistic rejection of the nation's moral obligation. Congress failed to override the veto by a narrow margin. Johnson felt triumphant. He believed he had won, and in his victory, he let his guard down. On February 22, 1866, Washington's birthday, a crowd gathered outside the White House to serenade the president. It was a festive occasion. Johnson stepped out onto the balcony. He should have waved, thanked the crowd, and gone back inside. Instead, fueled by the adrenaline of his recent victory, he decided to speak. It was the omen of March 4th all over again. Johnson launched into an hour-long, unscripted rant. He worked himself into a frenzy, his voice cracking as he shouted about his enemies. But this time, he went too far. He began to name names. "I fought those in the South who cried for treason," he bellowed to the bewildered crowd. "And now I fight those in the North who cry for the dissolution of the Union." The crowd shouted back, "Name them. Who are they?" Johnson didn't hesitate. "You ask me who they are? I say Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania is one. I say Charles Sumner of Massachusetts is another." The shock was palpable. The President of the United States was publicly accusing the leaders of his own party in Congress of being traitors equal to Jefferson Davis. He went even further, suggesting that these men were plotting his assassination. "Are they not satisfied with the blood of Lincoln?" he cried. "Do they want my blood too?" It was a moment of political suicide. By equating the abolitionists who had fought to save the Union with the secessionists who had tried to destroy it, Johnson severed the last thread of connection with the Republican Party. He stood alone. But the real war began in March. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This was a monumental piece of legislation, the grandfather of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It defined for the first time that all persons born in the United States were citizens. It guaranteed citizens of every race the right to make contracts, sue, give evidence in court, and buy property. It was the legal shield designed to smash the black codes. Johnson vetoed it. His veto message for the Civil Rights Act is a document that lays bare his soul. He didn't just argue on legal grounds. He argued on racial ones. He claimed that the bill discriminated against the white race. He wrote that granting citizenship to black people would be an insult to the white immigrants who had to wait years for naturalization. He famously asked whether the government should now become a military despotism to protect the rights of gypsies of the tropics. This was the breaking point. The moderates in Congress, who had been trying to find a middle ground, looked at Johnson's words and realized there was no reasoning with him. He was not just a strict constructionist, he was an obstacle to justice. In April 1866, Congress took a historic step. For the first time in the history of the United States, they overrode a presidential veto on a major piece of legislation. The Senate voted 33 to 15. The House followed. The Civil Rights Act became law over the president's dead body. The dam broke. Congress began to pass laws simply to provoke Johnson, knowing he would veto them and then overriding him to show his impotence. Johnson vetoed a second Freedmen's Bureau bill, overridden. He vetoed the admission of Nebraska as a state, overridden. He vetoed the Reconstruction Acts, overridden. He eventually racked up 29 vetoes, more than all previous presidents combined. But Congress overrode him 15 times. It was a humiliation. Johnson was president in title, but Congress was running the country. Cornered, furious, and delusional, Johnson decided he needed to break out of Washington. He convinced himself that the people were still with him. He believed that if he could just look the voters in the eye, if he could just explain himself in person, they would turn against the radicals in Congress. So, in the late summer of 1866, Andrew Johnson planned the most disastrous political campaign in American history. He called it the Swing Around the Circle. It was supposed to be a dignified presidential tour, traveling by train from Washington to New York, west to Chicago and St. Louis, and then back. He brought along heroes, General Ulysses S. Grant and Admiral David Farragut, using them as silent props to lend him credibility. It started well enough in New York with polite crowds, but as the train moved west into the heartland of the Union, the atmosphere turned toxic. The North had read the veto messages. They had read about the New Orleans massacre in July, where police fired into a convention of black and white Unionists, killing nearly 50 people while Johnson sat on his hands. They blamed him. In Cleveland, Ohio, the wheels came off. It was night. The crowd was massive, loud, and hostile. They began to heckle him. "Hang Jeff Davis," someone shouted. "Why don't you hang Thad Stevens?" Johnson shouted back. The crowd roared in anger. Johnson, his face flushing, lost all control. He engaged in a shouting match with the mob. He abandoned his prepared speech and started screaming about his martyrdom. "I have been traduced. I have been slandered. I have been called a Judas," he yelled. "If I have played the Judas, who has been my Christ that I have played the Judas with? Was it Thad Stevens? Was it Wendell Phillips?" It was a grotesque spectacle. The President of the United States standing on a balcony, comparing himself to Jesus and his political opponents to God while arguing with drunk hecklers. General Grant, standing behind him, looked sick with embarrassment. He later told a friend he was disgusted to be associated with such a display. The tour continued, and it got worse. In St. Louis, Johnson accused the Unionists in Congress of having planned the New Orleans massacre themselves to make him look bad. He was spinning wild conspiracy theories. He was visibly exhausted, his voice raspy, his temper frayed. The press reported, accurately or not, that he was drunk at almost every stop. The newspapers christened it the Drunken Circle. Cartoons depicted Johnson as an angry parrot repeating the same speech over and over. "My Constitution, my policy, I, the people." By the time the train limped back to Washington, Andrew Johnson was a political corpse. He had gone out to rally the country to his side. Instead, he had united the North against him in disgusted solidarity. The reckoning came in the midterm elections of November 1866. It was a slaughter. The Democrats and Johnson's conservative allies were annihilated. The Republicans won a massive veto-proof supermajority in both the House and the Senate. This was the end of the war by veto. Johnson had fired every shot he had. He had used the Constitution as a shield and a sword, but the voters had disarmed him. The new Congress that would convene in 1867 was not interested in negotiating with Andrew Johnson. They were not interested in his policy. They were now armed with enough votes to do whatever they wanted, regardless of what the president thought. But Andrew Johnson, true to his nature, would not surrender. He retreated into the White House, bitter and paranoid. He began to use his power as commander-in-chief to obstruct the military commanders in the South. He fired generals who were too tough on the rebels. He issued secret orders. He was becoming an insurgent in his own government. The radicals looked at the situation and realized that overriding vetoes wasn't enough. As long as Johnson controlled the army and the patronage, he could sabotage Reconstruction from the inside. They realized that the accidental president was a cancer on the body politic that had to be cut out. And so, in the smoke-filled committee rooms of the Capitol, the conversation shifted from legislation to something much darker. A word began to be whispered, a word that had never been seriously considered in the history of the Republic: impeachment. They began to look for a crime. They began to set a trap. And Andrew Johnson, blinded by his own hubris, was about to walk right into it. By the winter of 1867, Washington, D.C. had ceased to be a functioning capital of a democratic republic and had transformed into a city of spies, whispers, and paranoia, reminiscent of the Roman court in its final days of decay. The air was thick with the ozone of an approaching storm. The White House, once the People's House where Lincoln had welcomed ragged soldiers and grieving widows, was now a fortress of solitude. Inside, Andrew Johnson paced the corridors at night, a lonely, beleaguered figure, convinced that the walls were listening, and in a way, they were. The conflict between the president and the Congress had moved beyond politics. It had become a blood feud. The radical Republicans, now commanding a veto-proof supermajority, looked at the man in the executive mansion and saw not a president, but a usurper, a man from Tennessee who was actively using the powers of his office to undo the verdict of the battlefield. They saw him firing Union generals who dared to protect black citizens. They saw him replacing loyal postmasters with Confederate sympathizers. They saw him as a saboteur behind enemy lines. Thaddeus Stevens, the grim, club-footed leader of the radicals, was dying. His body was failing, but his will was made of iron. He had one final ambition before he met his maker: to see Andrew Johnson stripped of his office, his reputation, and his power. But Stevens knew that hatred was not a legal ground for impeachment. The Constitution required treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson was incompetent, racist, and obstinate. But was he a criminal? The radicals decided that if they couldn't find a crime, they would manufacture one. They would build a legal mousetrap, bait it with the one thing Johnson couldn't resist, and wait for the accidental president to snap his own neck. The trap was called the Tenure of Office Act. Passed in March 1867 over Johnson's inevitable veto, this law was a legislative straitjacket. It stipulated that the president could not remove any official whose appointment had been confirmed by the Senate without the Senate's consent. In essence, it froze the president's cabinet in place. He could not fire his own team. It was a constitutional absurdity. Since the founding of the Republic, it had been understood that the power to hire implied the power to fire. A president had to be able to dismiss subordinates who disagreed with him. Otherwise, the executive branch could not function. Johnson knew the law was unconstitutional. His lawyers knew it. Even many Republicans knew it. But the law wasn't designed to stand the test of time. It was designed to protect one specific man. Edwin McMaster Stanton, the Secretary of War, was a man of terrifying intensity. With a long, perfumed beard that reeked of cologne and eyes that peered sharply through wire-rimmed spectacles, Stanton was the Mars of the Union war effort. He had been Lincoln's right hand, a tireless administrator who had ground the Confederacy into dust. But under Johnson, Stanton had become a mole. He was a radical spy in the cabinet's midst. During cabinet meetings, Stanton would sit silently taking notes and then secretly report Johnson's plans to the radicals in Congress. He was actively undermining the president's orders regarding the military occupation of the South. Johnson hated him with a visceral, consuming passion. He called Stanton the betrayal in the room. Every time he looked at Stanton's smug, silent face across the table, Johnson felt his authority being mocked, his pride That fragile, swollen thing that governed all his actions could not take it. The radicals knew this. They knew Johnson's hamartia, his inability to swallow an insult. They knew that sooner or later Johnson's temper would override his caution. The standoff lasted for months, a tense game of chicken. Finally, in August 1867, while Congress was in recess, Johnson suspended Stanton. But when the Senate returned in January 1868, they refused to concur with the suspension and ordered Stanton reinstated. This was the moment. Johnson had a choice. He could swallow his pride, accept Stanton, and ride out the last year of his presidency in impotence. Or he could defy the Senate, fire Stanton outright, and trigger the trap. On February 21st, 1868, Andrew Johnson chose war. He issued a formal order firing Edwin Stanton and appointing a drunken, genial general named Lorenzo Thomas to replace him. The reaction was immediate and physical. Edwin Stanton refused to leave. He literally barricaded himself inside his office at the War Department. He locked the doors, ordered the windows barred, and posted armed guards in the hallway. For the next several weeks, the Secretary of War lived in his office, sleeping on a cot, eating meals passed to him through a slot, terrified that the president might use force to remove him. It was a scene of utter absurdity, a squatter in the cabinet. But the legal tripwire had been crossed. Johnson had knowingly violated the Tenure of Office Act. 3 days later, on February 24th, 1868, the House of Representatives erupted. Thaddeus Stevens, so weak he had to be carried into the chamber in a chair, rose to speak. His voice was a ghostly whisper, forcing the members to crowd around him to hear the death sentence of the presidency. "I impeach Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, of high crimes and misdemeanors in office," Stevens hissed. The vote was 126 to 47. It was done. For the first time in American history, a president had been impeached. The scene then shifted to the Senate, which was transformed into a high court of impeachment. This was the trial of the century, a spectacle that captivated the entire world. The Senate chamber was fitted with extra galleries. Tickets were printed, colored-coded for different days, and they became the most sought-after currency in America. Socialites, diplomats, and gamblers packed the pews. It was theater. It was a blood sport. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon P. Chase, presided in his flowing judicial robes. The House managers sat on one side, led by the ferocious Benjamin Butler, a man known as the Beast. On the other side sat the president's defense team, a group of brilliant, sharp-minded lawyers. Andrew Johnson wisely did not attend. His lawyers, knowing his temper, terrified that he would burst into a rant and convict himself, kept him locked in the White House. He spent the trial drinking, pacing, and receiving telegrams, obsessively counting the votes in his head. The trial lasted from March to May. It was a grinding, technical affair. The prosecution argued that Johnson had broken the law, plain and simple. He had fired Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act. Therefore, he must go. The defense, however, was surprisingly agile. They argued that the Tenure of Office Act didn't actually apply to Stanton. The law said a president couldn't fire an appointee during the term of the president who appointed them. Stanton had been appointed by Lincoln, not Johnson. Lincoln was dead, his term was over. Therefore, Johnson was free to fire him. It was a legal loophole, a technicality, but it sowed doubt. As the weeks dragged on, the emotional heat began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, hard political calculus. The Republicans had 45 seats in the Senate. The Democrats had 9. To convict, the prosecution needed a 2/3 majority, 36 votes. If all 45 Republicans voted guilty, Johnson was doomed. But cracks were forming in the party wall. There were men in the Senate, moderate Republicans, who despised Johnson but feared the precedent. They looked at the prosecution's case and saw it for what it was, a political hit job dressed up as a legal proceeding. They worried that if they removed a president just because they hated his politics, the American system of checks and balances would be destroyed forever. The presidency would become a subservient branch, its occupant terrified of Congress. 7 Republican senators began to waver. They were known as the recusants. The pressure brought to bear on these 7 men is almost impossible to describe today. They were not just lobbied, they were hunted. The radical press printed their names in black borders, as if they were already dead. Spies rifled through their trash. Detectives followed them to brothels and bars, looking for blackmail material. Delegations from their home states arrived in Washington to scream at them. They received telegrams saying, "Vote guilty or never return home." One by one, the undecideds made up their minds. But as the final vote approached, the entire verdict came down to one man. Edmund G. Ross was a nobody, a freshman senator from Kansas. He had been appointed to fill a vacancy. He was a radical abolitionist, a man who had fought in the bloody border wars of bleeding Kansas. He hated Johnson. He had voted for every radical measure. Everyone assumed his vote for conviction was in the bag. But Ross was silent. He refused to say how he would vote. He stayed in a boarding house where he was besieged. Radical colleagues badgered him day and night. At one point, a senator told him, "Ross, if you don't vote guilty, you will be the most hated man in America. You will be ruined." Ross simply looked at him and said, "I know." On the morning of May 16, 1868, the day of the vote, the tension in Washington was physically painful. The city was silent, holding its breath. The telegraph wires running from the Capitol to the White House were humming, ready to flash the word guilty or acquitted. Inside the Senate chamber, the air was stifling. Every seat was filled. The gallery was a sea of fans, fluttering in the humid heat. Chief Justice Chase called the Senate to order. They would vote on the 11th article of impeachment first, considered the strongest charge. The clerk began to call the roll. Mr. Anthony? Guilty. Mr. Bayard? Not guilty. The names ticked by, alphabetical, agonizingly slow. The count was razor thin. It was going exactly according to the whip counts. Everyone knew how the heavy hitters would vote. Then the clerk reached the R's. Mr. Ross. The name hung in the air. 1,000 heads turned. In the gallery, people leaned over the railings. On the floor, Thaddeus Stevens turned his sunken eyes toward the back row. Edmund G. Ross stood up. He was a small man, unremarkable in appearance. He later wrote that in that moment, he looked down into his own open grave. He knew that a vote of not guilty would destroy his life. He would lose his seat. He would be branded a traitor. He would be ostracized by his friends, his party, and his state. But Ross also looked at the Constitution. He looked at the flimsy partisan evidence presented by the prosecution. He realized that if he voted guilty merely to save his career, he would be helping to turn the United States into a parliamentary dictatorship where the president served at the whim of Congress. The Chief Justice looked at him. "Mr. Senator Ross, how say you? Is the respondent Andrew Johnson guilty or not guilty of a high misdemeanor as charged in this article?" The silence stretched. It was the loudest silence in American history. A tear was seen running down the cheek of a nearby senator. Ross cleared his throat. His voice was not loud, but it was steady. "Not guilty." A gasp ripped through the room. The radicals looked as if they had been physically struck. The clerk continued the roll call, but the math was done. The dam had held. When the final tally was announced, 35 guilty, 19 not guilty, the prosecution was exactly 1 vote short of the 2/3 majority needed. Andrew Johnson was acquitted. In the White House, when the news arrived by telegraph, Johnson wept. He poured whiskey for his staff. He was saved. But the victory was ashes. He was a president in name only, stripped of influence, hated by half the country, distrusted by the other half. He had survived the trap, but he was legally and politically crippled. And for Edmund Ross, the prophecy came true. He was destroyed. Newspapers called him a Judas and a Benedict Arnold. He was burned in effigy in Kansas. He lost his bid for re-election. He died in poverty and obscurity, working as a printer in New Mexico. It would take nearly a century before John F. Kennedy, in his book Profiles in Courage, would resurrect Ross's reputation as the man who saved the American presidency from mob rule. But on that humid afternoon in May 1868, as the gavel banged and the stunned crowd filed out into the sunlight, the immediate reality was clear. The attempt to remove the president had failed. The accidental traitor would finish his term. And with his survival, the hope for a rigorous, just, and enforced reconstruction of the South began to die. The energy had been drained from the radical cause. The country was tired of the drama. They just wanted to move on. And in that desire to move on, they would leave 4 million freed slaves behind. The gavel fell, and Andrew Johnson was saved. But as the summer of 1868 burned itself out, the president discovered a fate perhaps worse than removal: irrelevance. He was a political ghost haunting the corridors of power. The radical Republicans, though defeated in the trial, had effectively neutered him. They ignored his messages. They overrode his vetoes without even pausing to debate them. The presidency had been hollowed out, leaving a bitter, isolated man sitting in the executive mansion, watching his power evaporate like water on a hot pavement. In these final twilight months of his administration, there occurred one of the strangest and most ironic episodes of his career, a moment of dazzling foresight amidst the domestic wreckage. It didn't come from Johnson, but from his loyal Secretary of State, William Seward. Seward, a man of boundless imagination who had survived the assassin's knife on the night Lincoln died, had a vision of an American empire stretching into the Arctic. In 1867, the Russian Empire broke and, fearing a war with Britain, offered to sell its vast frozen territory in North America. Seward jumped at the chance. He negotiated a treaty to purchase Alaska for $7.2 million, roughly 2 cents an acre. When the deal was announced, the press howled with laughter. They called it Seward's Folly, Johnson's Polar Bear Garden, and Walrussia. They mocked the administration for buying a sucked orange, a wasteland of ice and rocks. Johnson, consumed by his impeachment battles, paid little attention to it. He signed the treaty, but his heart wasn't in it. He was too busy fighting the ghosts of the Confederacy. Yet this purchase stands today as the single greatest strategic achievement of the Johnson years. It is a profound irony that the man who was so myopic about the human rights of his own citizens presided over the acquisition of a territory that would one day yield gold, oil, and strategic dominance in the Pacific. It was a diamond found in a sewer, but land deals could not save him. As the election of 1868 approached, Johnson engaged in a final, delusional fantasy. He actually believed the Democratic Party would nominate him for a second term. He thought the people had seen his martyrdom and would reward him. He was wrong. The Democrats wanted his white supremacist policies, but they didn't want his baggage. At their convention, they didn't even seriously consider him. Instead, the country turned its eyes to the silent, cigar-smoking Sphinx of the North, General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant ran on a slogan of heartbreaking simplicity: "Let us have peace." It was a direct rebuke to the chaos of the Johnson years. Grant won in a landslide. The country was screaming for normalcy. The transition of power in March 1869 provided the final petty punctuation mark to Johnson's presidency. Traditionally, the outgoing president rides in a carriage with the incoming president to the Capitol. It is a symbol of the peaceful transfer of power, a visual demonstration that the office is greater than the man. Johnson refused to go. He told his cabinet, "I think we will finish up our work here." While Ulysses S. Grant was being sworn in, taking the oath to protect the nation Johnson had divided, Andrew Johnson sat in the White House, signing routine papers until the clock struck noon. Then he simply walked out the door. He was the first president since John Adams to snub his successor. He left as he had arrived, angry, proud, and alone. He returned to Greenville, Tennessee, to the dust and the heat, but he could not find peace. The hamartia that had driven him all his life, the burning need to prove his betters wrong, would not let him rest. He was possessed by a demon of vindication. He needed to prove that he was right, and the rest of America was wrong. For 6 years, the former President of the United States debased himself in local politics. He ran for the U.S. Senate and lost. He ran for the U.S. House of Representatives and lost. He gave speeches on courthouse steps to dwindling crowds, rehashing the arguments of 1866, railing against the military despotism of President Grant. He was like a fallen king trying to become a mayor. The nation looked on with a mix of pity and embarrassment, but Johnson was nothing if not tenacious. By 1875, the political winds in Tennessee had shifted. The Reconstruction government had collapsed, and the old Confederate elite, the very men Johnson had once hated but then empowered, were back in control. They remembered that Johnson had saved them from the radicals. In January 1875, the Tennessee legislature voted to send Andrew Johnson back to the United States Senate. It was a resurrection. No former president had ever returned to the Senate. When the news broke, Johnson was ecstatic. "Thank God," he cried, "I am vindicated." He viewed it not as a new job, but as a victory lap. He packed his bags for Washington, eager to stare down the men who had tried to remove him. The scene in the Senate chamber on March 5, 1875, was electric. The galleries were packed once again. When the doors opened and the old tailor walked in, a hush fell over the room. There sat the men who had voted guilty. There sat the men who had called him a traitor. But time softens even the hardest stones. As Johnson walked down the aisle, a strange thing happened. The senators stood up. Even his enemies stood. There was a smattering of applause. Flowers were placed on his desk. It was a moment of bizarre, uncomfortable reconciliation. Johnson took his oath, his hand trembling slightly, his face lined with age, but his eyes still burning with that old, cold fire. He gave one speech. It was a furious attack on President Grant's policies in Louisiana. He was still fighting the war. He was still defending the rights of the white South. He hadn't learned a thing. It was his swan song. The anger that fueled him was also consuming him. In July 1875, Johnson traveled to his daughter's home in Carter Station, Tennessee. He was sitting in an armchair, talking about his political enemies, when the stroke hit him. He fell from his chair, his side paralyzed. He lingered for a day, drifting in and out of consciousness, perhaps replaying the trials and the vetoes in the fading theater of his mind. He died on July 31st, 1875. He was 66 years old. His funeral instructions were specific and deeply revealing. He asked to be buried wrapped in the American flag, with a copy of the United States Constitution placed under his head as a pillow. On a hot August day, they lowered him into the rocky soil of Greenville. The flag was draped around his cold body. The parchment was tucked beneath his skull. And so we are left with the final tragic image, the man who did more to tear the nation apart than any politician after the Civil War, resting eternally on the symbol of its unity. Andrew Johnson's legacy is not just a list of vetoes or a failed impeachment. It is measured in the lost decades of American possibility. He was the accidental traitor, not because he sold secrets to an enemy, but because he betrayed the purpose of the war. Lincoln's War was fought to preserve a union that was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Johnson's peace was dedicated to the proposition that this was and should forever remain a white man's government. By emboldening the defeated South in 1865, by stopping the redistribution of land, by dismantling the Freedmen's Bureau, and by turning a blind eye to the black codes, Johnson allowed the spirit of the Confederacy to survive its military defeat. He gave the old order time to regroup. He planted the seeds of Jim Crow. Because of Andrew Johnson, the window of opportunity to build a true multiracial democracy in the 19th century, a window that was briefly, tantalizingly open, slammed shut. It would not open again for another 100 years until the civil rights movement of the 1960s forced the nation to finish the work that Johnson had sabotaged. He was a man of grit, courage, and iron will. He pulled himself up from the mud of poverty to the pinnacle of power. But he lacked the one thing that separates a politician from a statesman: the ability to grow. He remained until his dying breath the tailor from Raleigh, stitching together a garment that could not fit a changing world. He saved his own presidency, but he lost the nation's soul. And in the silence of the history books, beneath the flag he loved and the Constitution he twisted, that is the tragedy of Andrew Johnson. He was the wrong man at the wrong time who made the wrong choice, and we are still living with the consequences